Stray dog was moments from being put down. Then the vet reads one word on his collar. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile examination room as Dr. Madison Reed studied the white German Shepherd's chart for the third time. Her heart felt heavy, knowing what usually came next in cases like these. The dog had been brought in as a stray, severely dehydrated and showing signs of smoke inhalation. No microchip, no tags, just another lost soul in an overcrowded system. She reached out to stroke the dog's matted fur, noticing how he leaned into her touch despite his obvious exhaustion. His eyes, though clouded with fatigue, held an intelligence that made her pause. Something about this one was different. "I'm sorry, boy," she whispered, reaching for the syringe of euthanasia solution. The shelter was beyond capacity, and their policy was clear about unadopted strays after 72 hours. Her fingers trembled slightly, even after 15 years as a veterinarian. This part never got easier. As she moved closer, her hand brushed against something beneath the dog's thick fur. Frowning, she parted the white coat to reveal a worn leather collar, so weathered it had nearly melded with the fur. Most of its surface was scratched and faded, but one word stood out, deeply carved into the leather: home. Madison set down the syringe and leaned in closer. The collar was clearly old, but the carving seemed deliberate, almost desperate. "Where is your home, boy?" she murmured, examining the collar more carefully. There was something else there, barely visible beneath years of wear. The faintest impression of letters that might once have spelled Scout. The white shepherd's tail thumped weakly against the examination table. "Hold on," Madison told him, reaching for her phone. "Let's see if we can solve this mystery before making any irreversible decisions." 60 miles away, in the small town of Cedar Grove, 13-year-old Olivia Bennett sat at her bedroom window in her aunt's house, watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass. The room was filled with boxes she still hadn't unpacked, though they'd been living here for 8 months now. Unpacking felt too much like accepting that this was home. And home was gone, burned to ashes along with everything else that mattered. Everything except Scout. She pulled out the worn photograph from under her pillow, the last one taken of them together, Scout's white fur gleaming in the summer sun as he stood proudly beside her at last year's junior handler competition. They'd won first place, though the ribbon had burned with everything else. "He's still out there," she whispered, touching the photograph gently. "I know he is." Her Aunt Sarah's voice floated up from downstairs. "Olivia? Dinner's ready, sweetheart." Olivia tucked the photo away and headed down, passing the wall of family photos her aunt had hung in an attempt to make the house feel more like home. But home wasn't a place anymore. Home was a white German shepherd with kind eyes and a heart brave enough to wake them all that terrible night. The night of the fire. Detective James Carter of the Cedar Grove Police Department stared at the pattern of red pins on his office wall map. 8 fires in 8 months, spreading outward from Cedar Grove in an ever-widening circle. The latest had been reported just yesterday, an abandoned warehouse in Millbrook, 60 miles away. He rubbed his tired eyes, thinking about the Bennett case. It had started there, with what appeared to be a tragic accident. An electrical fire that had destroyed the home of Thomas Bennett and his daughter Olivia. Thomas hadn't made it out. The fire marshal's report cited faulty wiring, but something had never sat right with Carter. Maybe it was the way Thomas Bennett's development company had been on the verge of exposing a major real estate fraud scheme. Maybe it was the string of similar fires that followed, each destroying properties that had recently changed hands under suspicious circumstances. Or maybe it was the missing dog. Carter picked up the Bennett case file, flipping to the witness statements from that night. Olivia's account stood out. Scout started barking and wouldn't stop. He jumped on my bed, pulled at my pajamas until I woke up. The hallway was already full of smoke, but he led me to the window. Dad was yelling for me to climb down the tree outside. Scout went back in. I think he was trying to get to Dad. I never saw him again. The detective's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. The number was unfamiliar. Detective Carter speaking. Detective, this is Dr. Madison Reed from the Millbrook Animal Shelter. I'm calling about a dog that was brought in 3 days ago. A white German Shepherd found near the warehouse fire on Oak Street. Carter sat up straighter, reaching for a pen. Go on. He's wearing an unusual collar with the word home carved into it. I've been making calls trying to track down his owner, and Cedar Grove PD suggested I contact you. The detective was already grabbing his keys. Keep that dog there, Dr. Reed. I'm on my way. The memories came in flashes as Scout drifted in and out of consciousness on the cold metal table. The smell of smoke. The girl, his girl, slept peacefully until he woke her. The man who always smelled like coffee and newspapers, shouting for them to get out. The desperate need to go back, to save him. Then darkness, pain, and the rough hands that had grabbed him in the chaos. The long drive in a strange vehicle. More fires, more fear. But this time he was forced to watch as the bad men did their work. The heavy chain that kept him tied up between jobs, as they called them. But Scout hadn't forgotten. Through all those months of captivity, he'd remembered the word he'd seen carved into wooden signs around their neighborhood. Home. During a rare moment alone, he'd used his teeth to scratch it into his collar, hoping someone would understand. The kind woman in the white coat had noticed. She smelled like healing and hope, so different from the men who had kept him prisoner. When she returned to the room, another scent accompanied her. One that reminded Scout of the man who had investigated the first fire, who had knelt down to pet him and looked at him with knowing eyes. Scout lifted his head, suddenly alert. Detective Carter stood in the doorway of the examination room, studying the white German Shepherd with a mix of amazement and professional interest. Despite months of apparent neglect, the dog's bearing was dignified, almost regal. Those intelligent eyes met Carter's without wavering. The shelter workers found him wandering near the warehouse fire, Dr. Reed explained, showing Carter the collar. He was dehydrated, exhausted, but oddly familiar with fire scenes, according to the firefighters. They said he seemed to be searching for something, methodically checking different areas. Or someone, Carter murmured, approaching slowly. Hello, Scout. You've been missed. The dog's tail thumped against the table. You know him? Dr. Reed asked. I think this is Olivia Bennett's dog, missing since her house burned down 8 months ago. The question is, where has he been all this time? Carter pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos, finding one taken at the Bennett fire scene. He held it up next to Scout. The markings matched perfectly. But how did he end up 60 miles away? That's what I intend to find out. Carter scratched behind Scout's ears, noting how the dog leaned into his touch. Dr. Reed, how soon can he travel? There's a young girl in Cedar Grove who's been waiting a very long time to see him. He needs at least 24 hours of observation and treatment for smoke inhalation. After that, if all his vitals remain stable. She paused, looking at Scout thoughtfully. You think he's connected to your arson cases, don't you? 8 fires in 8 months, each targeting properties involved in a complex real estate scheme. And now we find Thomas Bennett's dog at the latest fire scene? Carter shook his head. There are no coincidences in my line of work, Doctor. The next evening, Sarah Bennett was just finishing the dinner dishes when a police car pulled into her driveway. Her heart skipped a beat. In the months since her brother's death, she developed an instinctive dread of unexpected police visits. But then she saw Detective Carter stepping out of the car, and he was smiling. He moved to the back door and opened it, and Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as a familiar white shape emerged. Olivia! She called up the stairs, her voice shaking. Olivia, come down here right now. What's wrong? Olivia appeared at the top of the stairs, worried by the urgency in her aunt's voice. Then she saw the open front door, the detective standing there, and Scout? The white German shepherd's ears perked up at the sound of her voice. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the girl and dog stared at each other across the distance of 8 long months. Scout! Olivia flew down the stairs as Scout bounded forward, all exhaustion forgotten. They met in the middle of the living room, Olivia falling to her knees as Scout covered her face with frantic kisses, his whole body wiggling with joy. "I knew it," Olivia sobbed, burying her face in his fur. "I knew you were alive. I knew you'd come home." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she turned to Detective Carter. "Where did you find him?" "It's a long story," Carter replied, watching the reunion with satisfaction. "And I think Scout here might be the key to finding some answers we've been looking for." Over the next few days, as Scout readjusted to life with Olivia, Detective Carter began piecing together the puzzle. The dog's presence at multiple fire scenes wasn't random. He had been forced to accompany the arsonists, perhaps as a way to prevent him from finding his way back to Cedar Grove. But Scout had been watching, learning, remembering. The break in the case came 3 nights later, when Scout's barking woke the household. Sarah found him standing at the back door, growling at something in the darkness. When Carter arrived with backup, they discovered fresh footprints in the garden and signs that someone had been attempting to break in. Scout led them on a trail that ended at an unmarked van parked 2 blocks away. Inside, they found maps marking potential targets, all properties owned by Maxwell Development Group, the company Thomas Bennett had been investigating before his death. The driver, caught trying to flee the scene, was a former security guard for Maxwell Development. Under questioning, he revealed the entire scheme. Maxwell had been buying up properties through shell companies, deliberately starting fires to drive down property values in targeted neighborhoods, then acquiring more land at reduced prices. Thomas Bennett had discovered the pattern and was preparing to expose it all. The fire at his house was meant to destroy his evidence. They hadn't known he would be home that night. "And Scout?" Carter asked the suspect. "Why take the dog?" "Boss's orders. Said the mutt saw too much, might lead cops back to us somehow. Kept him chained up between jobs." The man shifted uncomfortably. Dog never stopped trying to escape. Carved something into his collar with his teeth. Crazy smart animal. One by one, the pieces of the conspiracy fell into place. Maxwell Development CEO, Richard Maxwell, was arrested along with several accomplices. The evidence trail led to corrupt city officials, insurance fraud, and a pattern of criminal activity stretching back years. Through it all, Scout stayed close to Olivia, slowly regaining his strength and trust. The local media dubbed him the hero hound of Cedar Grove, but to Olivia, he was simply Scout, her protector, her friend, her home. 1 year later, Olivia stood before a crowd at the Cedar Grove Community Center, Scout sitting proudly at her side. The mayor had just unveiled a new K-9 training facility named in honor of Thomas Bennett, dedicated to preparing dogs for search and rescue and arson investigation work. "Scout taught us something important," Olivia said, her voice clear and strong. "Home isn't just a place. It's the love that leads us back to where we belong, no matter how far we have to go." She reached down to touch the new collar around Scout's neck. Leather, like the old one, but with a proper tag this time. Still, if you looked closely, you could see that one word had been carefully tooled into the leather, right next to his name. Home. Detective Carter, watching from the audience, smiled as he remembered Dr. Reed's call that day at the shelter. One word on a collar, carved by a desperate dog who never gave up on finding his way back. Sometimes, he reflected, the smallest clues led to the biggest breakthroughs. After the ceremony, he watched Scout and Olivia walking home together through the autumn evening, their shadows long in the setting sun. The white German shepherd still moved with the same dignity he'd shown in that shelter examination room, But now there was peace in his bearing, contentment in every step. They had both found their way home, not to a place, but to each other. And in doing so, they had brought justice, healing, and closure to an entire community. Scout had kept his promise that terrible night of the fire, to protect, to serve, to love. And in the end, love had led him home. Sarah Bennett stood at her kitchen window that evening, watching Olivia and Scout playing in the backyard. The girl was laughing, a sound that had been all too rare in the months after the fire. Scout bounded around her with the energy of a much younger dog, his white coat glowing in the golden light. The house still held memories of Thomas. Sarah saw her brother in Olivia's smile, heard echoes of his laughter in the halls. But now those memories brought more comfort than pain. Justice had been served, thanks to an extraordinary dog who refused to give up. On the windowsill sat a framed photograph from the K-9 facility dedication ceremony. Olivia and Scout, standing together just as they had in that long-ago competition photo. But this time, there was something different in their eyes, a depth, a wisdom, a shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything and find your way back. Sarah touched the glass gently, remembering something Thomas used to say, "Home is where your story begins." Scout and Olivia's story hadn't ended in fire and loss. It had only begun there. What followed was a tale of courage, loyalty, and the kind of love that could carve hope into a leather collar and carry it 60 miles home. Outside, Scout looked up at the window and wagged his tail, as if sensing her thoughts. Sarah waved back, grateful for this miraculous dog who had brought so much healing to their lives. Some might call it coincidence that Dr. Reed had noticed that collar in time, that Detective Carter had connected the dots, that Scout had led them to the truth. But Sarah knew better. She knew that love, like Scout's devotion to Olivia, could work miracles. It could lead you home, even when home seemed lost forever. It could give you strength to fight for justice, courage to face your fears, and hope when all seemed dark. In the end, that was Scout's greatest gift to them all. The reminder that home wasn't a place that could burn down or be taken away. Home was the love that lived in your heart, guiding you back to where you belonged. As the sun set over Cedar Grove, Scout and Olivia came inside together, their footsteps echoing through the house that had become a home. And somewhere, Sarah liked to think, Thomas was smiling, knowing that his daughter and her faithful dog had found their way back to each other, and in doing so, had helped an entire community find its way to justice, healing, and hope. The word carved into Scout's collar had been more than just letters scratched into leather. It had been a promise, a prayer, a declaration of faith, home. And in keeping that promise, Scout had become more than just a hero. He had become a symbol of everything that mattered most: loyalty, courage, and love that never gives up. That's what home really means, after all. And Scout had known it all along.